Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar on death audit versus death data and how to get the best results. We have Jason with us today and he will be presenting. He is the new business development manager here at PBI. He has years of experience with clients across the country helping minimize overpayments, save time and resources, and document for compliance. He's excited to talk about everything death audit and death data. So I'm going to hand over the presentation over to Jason to tell us what's going on in the industry, the differences between death audit and death data, and what you can do to extend the life of your pension plan.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. As soon as our agenda here, for the next 30 minutes, we're going to discuss the key differences between what the industry has historically called death audit. And then we're going to compare that to what most people are using today, which you'll learn we actually refer to as death data. And then we'll also talk about the impacts that that has on your plan. And then all of that, we're still going to try and leave some time for Q&A at the end as well. So with that, we will jump to the next slide. And if you take a look at this slide, I think let's actually start and go back. Gosh, if you want to go back to the original death audit that was out there, I think the Social Security Administration actually created the death master file, made it publicly available in 1980. Originally, the file was updated on a quarterly basis, for those of you that will remember that, and it contained the name, date of birth, date of death, zip code, and social security number for decedents across the nation. Now, I think originally it was probably on magnetic tape, maybe a DAT tape, something of that nature. Certainly that moved to CDs and then electronic. But all the time, it covered about 95% of the available deaths across the US. And it was the most consistent, well, actually, it was the only consistent and single source of death data to confirm deaths. And, you know, vendors would use that and deliver a true death audit back to you. The important part also to remember is that if you're using the DMF data, it only used one data point, and that was a person's social security number. So prior to 2011, and really even some years after, this was the source for doing a death audit for plans across the US, okay? The challenges started in 2011, as you see here, when the death master file actually stopped including protected state death records. This was due to some of its contractual obligations to the states, and the administration immediately in 2011 pulled, I believe it was 4.2 million death records from that database. And then moving forward, they've been adding about 1 million less records a year since 2011. And as you see here, kind of represented in the black, this has dramatically decreased the amount of data available for deaths via the DMF, or the death master file. And as you can see here, the percentage of available deaths actually went from that 95% plus in 2011 to roughly 23% is measured just a few years ago. That alone would have created a delta that would have been difficult to deal with. But when you couple that with kind of the gray part of this chart, you see that those are the CDC reported deaths, and they have increased. Obviously, we could guess at some of those reasons, but they've increased and have been growing year over year in creating a larger and larger gap. So you're left with a death master file that used to, you know, almost give you 100% of the deaths across the US to today only giving you those 23% of deaths. And, you know, the question of the day is, and what we'll talk about is, how do you fulfill your duties on behalf of the plan in identifying decedents, gosh, in trying to prevent or stop overpayments, or benefits to limit unnecessary funding for like your term vested population. Gosh, not to mention PBGC premiums for those of you that pay that. And also, how do you prevent fraud or the misuse of accounts that are deceased? So, the big question is, what can you actually do? Well, since 2011, people have been scrambling on how to find alternatives or how to fill this gap. And, to perform death audits and overcome this gap, people have come up with a few different sources to look at. They had to find alternatives in identifying those deaths other than the DMF, and they actually turned to a couple different sources. And Megan, if you could flip to the next slide. So as you see here, and again, remembering that the death master file today is effectively 23%, you had to find alternative ways to identify deaths. And even if you layer state records, so available state records, not the protected ones, you're still only at 38%. And that still leaves a huge gap. So because of this, the industry had to adjust and had to find alternative sources for deaths. And as you can see here represented in red, death sources or obituaries, and we kind of use that term interchangeably, are now the primary alternative in data sources utilized, as seen here today. While true obits are becoming more and more rare, we do use those terms interchangeably, and we will use death sources. An example of those could be, instead of a obituary, could be a tribute for a decedent. It could be a posting from a funeral home. Gosh, you can even find these through churches, associations, or even the local Moose or Oddfellows Lodge. So with that, if you're looking at this pie, it would seem that, okay, you've got all of the information there, so you've solved for the gap, correct? Well, sort of. The increased reliance actually on death sources or obituaries introduced two new data challenges. One was where you were used to going to a single source before for deaths, which would have been the death master file, and producing a single data point to identify those deaths and to be able to validate it. Now you had to kind of cull or bring together multiple sources of obituaries, and then you actually have to find a logical way to try and validate deaths by using those obituaries, with some level of certainty. You see, using the DMF was fairly simple, and to deliver an audit to you back in the day was as simple as just using that single data source and using the social against that, and then being able to deliver to clients a death based on a social security number and based on the DMF. But with introducing obituaries, now all of a sudden, you have to aggregate thousands of available sources that are out there. And since obituaries have no consistent, I guess what we'll call a unique identifier, like a social, that can be used to validate a decedent, you now have to review each one of those obituaries to try and find a death and make sure that it's your person. And actually, this is where the fun comes in. As the death audit changes from delivering a confirmed match based on a single and reliable data point to dealing with what we'll call death data and managing multiple possibilities within that data with varying degrees of completeness to try and fill that 62%, that gap. So in effect, instead of a vendor being able to simply tell you who was dead in a population prior to 2011, after then and today, you're left with some validated deaths, still from the DMF and from state records, but the lion's share of suspected deaths are delivered to you as quote unquote possible deaths that might be your vendor. You're now having to use data that is never consistent, and there is no mandated format for tributes or obits that exist. Sure, some of the information is listed in an obituary, the majority of the time, but the industry has forced us to find a way to cull through the obits and try to limit the minutia of possible deaths. In most cases, making an educated guess to verify that that's your person. So vendors have been delivering the small and dwindling, I guess I would say, percentages of exact matches, and now also deliver possible matches or guesses based on obituary information that you review and validate. To handle that, most providers today have developed a matching system of high, medium, and low likelihood, and they'll deliver that to you to assist in the validation. But really, the big shift from a death audit provider to a death data provider or receiving death data has significantly placed the burden of proof on your shoulders because of just receiving death data. You are left with creating processes to confirm decedents by validating those obituaries. To accommodate this work, what we've seen is companies have taken different approaches to verify deaths. Some companies will only review the high probability matches. Others have invested in resources to review the high or medium probability matches, but those resources, they aren't fully dedicated to the task of just death data verification, so they're not necessarily experts. And as you can imagine, the added burden of data review coupled with differing processes has resulted in an inconsistent death match identification and a significant number of deaths across the industries are actually being missed. So go ahead and flip to the next slide. Great. So now that you have access to all of the data again, because remember we have the 23% from the death master file, we can layer on the available state records at 15, and we can kind of backfill that gray section, if you remember from that first slide, by the obituaries, which equal that 62%. It would seem that you have the ability to get back to that 95%. But remember, we started with the DMF back in the day producing roughly that 95%. But when you actually look at where we're at today, what you're getting that are actually validated deaths could be up to the 38%. But you're still missing a large piece. And remember when we said that vendors are now just delivering death data to you outside of those, that 38%, and that you would have to validate those deaths based on multiple obits for a pensioner, which by the way could be multiple obituaries for a single pensioner. Well, we've measured the data flow, or we've measured the results, not just on files that we've seen come in, but also on some of our clients that still use some of our death data product. And what we found is that even the best folks that are out there that are able to do this in-house are finding roughly 70% of the available deaths. So what you see here is prior to 2011, 95% were the deaths that were available. After 2011, you've seen the database dwindle down to that 23%. If you layer on state records to that, you can get up to 38. But even though it would seem that, from a data source perspective, and by adding obituaries, you could get back to 90%, because of the tedium of having to work through those obituaries and confirm your people. What we've seen is that most people are averaging about 70%. And of course, I know to some respect I'm preaching to the choir here, but obviously this means that you may be paying dead people, or not paying a beneficiary, or supplying medical benefits to a spouse as promised. You could be overfunding for the liability on your term vesteds when you don't need to, or again, even paying premiums or insurance on people that are no longer living. And that was a big reason why we had created CertiDeath back in 2019, which now will give you back that 95% of available deaths. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, so let's look at the next slide to see why these numbers are really playing out this way. So again, first, kind of going back to death data. If you look at the flow here, while it's certainly not exhaustive, it is a representation or an example of what you can expect at looking at a death data process. And Megan, you can go ahead and show the death audit one alongside. So remember, where we started this presentation was discussing the original death audit back in 1980, where you're given validated results back for your pensioners. Well, we're using that as the ideal scenario here. What I would ask you is to take a look at these flows and compare your current flow or process to these. And I think what you'll see is that one is obviously much simpler and does not involve work on your part in regard to submitting, or in regard to validating deaths, rather. And it's simply submitting a file and receiving a true death audit back. If you're using a death data service today, whether that would be ours or competitors, you're providing a file to us to be monitored and receiving some validated data back, that comes back from the DMF, the death master file, or state records, or gosh, in some cases, legacy records. But the lion's share of deaths that you're receiving, if you remember that 62%, are hidden within the obituary results that you're getting. And if you're not adept, if you don't have the expertise at identifying them, or if you're only working through the most likely deaths, remember those high, medium, or lows, you are missing deaths. And we determined that this was not acceptable. So we wanted to try and get back to the original death audit process, as you would see here. And the neat part about it is we actually did it. As hinted here, and as you'll see on a couple of the following slides, we are actually able to get back to providing you with a true death audit, not death data, and give you access to 95% of the deaths across the US. And as you see here, with a 99.9% accuracy. So Megan, if you want to flip to the next slide. So let's take a look at how this idea of death audit would compare to the typical death data service that's out there, including our own standard death data service, by the way, because I know we have some clients on the line. As you can see, they both include DMF and state records, but where the secret sauce really kicks in, I guess I would say, is within the obituaries or death sources and how they're handled. That seems to be what would kind of cut between death data and death audit. By using death data or a death data service, the balance of the validation of deaths through obituaries, again, remember back to the 62%, falls on you. And it has implications that, gosh, if you compare it to a true death audit, that you're sacrificing speed, you're sacrificing accuracy, and ultimately you're sacrificing the ability to find all of the decedents within that population. And again, as you can see here, what we've seen is that death data, or people that use death data or death data vendors, are finding up to 70%, versus this utopian thought of going back to the original DMF and finding 95% of the available deaths that are out there. But plain and simple, and as you'll see, if you're not using CertiDeath, which is our death audit, you're missing deaths, and you're potentially putting yourself, your plan, gosh, even your pensioners in harm's way by missing up to roughly 25% of the available deaths that are out there. And this is why we've actually created CertiDeath, and why it's the industry's best death solution that's out there. And Megan, go ahead and flip to the next slide. All right, so taking a look at CertiDeath, gosh, what we found is that CertiDeath is not only, as the tagline would say here, the industry's best death audit solution, but really it's the only true death audit solution that's out there. PBI has invested significant resources in developing CertiDeath since it was launched in 2019, and it continues to deliver validated deaths and not death data comprised of some validated death plus, again, in quotation mark, guesses. It actually provides better results than the original DMF, as it delivers the deaths faster than before, and due to the nature of using obituary postings or death sources, and it has less false positives. And this is really largely due, as you see here, to the 4 main steps that make up the solution. And the best part is that these are seamless to you, and it doesn't involve action on your part. But CertiDeath includes the most complete set of death data, scanning around 26 to 27,000 death sources daily. CertiDeath uses constantly evolving matching algorithms and artificial intelligence, which have been developed and they're overseen by our data science team. It also uses human expertise. So where the system cannot fully validate a death, it will kick it out to a team of dedicated folks that are reviewing and validating the death matches. And then lastly, or finally, it delivers a true death audit back to you, giving you availability of 95% of the deaths across the US with that 99% accuracy. So CertiDeath is the only death audit solution that delivers fully validated results faster and more accurately than you can do by yourself or really through any other vendor. And then Megan, if you want to go ahead and flip it. So because CertiDeath is so materially different than just getting death data from a vendor, we've actually developed a way for you to test your file and prove that CertiDeath delivers more value than the process that you're doing today. And we ask that you test us. We call it our CertiDeath analysis, as you see here, and this is probably an eye chart for a lot of you, especially if you're on a laptop. But really what we do is we will take your file and we will perform a summary analysis of that file and deliver back to you relevant data, such as the number of deaths that we found in your file, the age of those deaths, and the savings that you will see by using CertiDeath. In many cases, we're able to identify and drill down on decedents for you that you've been paying for years, unbeknownst to you. This is completely complementary, and the analysis that we'll do for you, so you can see what a true death audit can do for you, and what the immediate impact you can expect by using CertiDeath. And really, to perform this audit, it's as simple as contacting your PBI sales rep or your account manager and requesting the analysis, and then we'll take it from there. So we not only make the claims in regard to talking about death data, death audit, or the differences, but we want to prove that to you. And we hope that you accept our challenge and look forward to showing you the differences between a true death audit powered by CertiDeath versus what you're using today. And with that, Megan, if you want to flip to the next slide, really, when you switching gears here, and we're almost out of time, it's ironic because when you do something very well, you're actually referred a lot of business, and many folks are referred to us for our death audit, or even many clients know us by our death audit because they've been clients for so many years. But pictured here is we also have additional services to help or assist kind of with those natural outflow of needs or services from a death audit. And especially as the climate focuses more and more on managing missing participants, RMDs, uncashed checks, or finding beneficiaries, we've got you covered. So if you have any needs, we just wanted to make sure that we kind of threw this up here at the end. As you see here, we'd love to learn more about kind of what some of your challenges are and see if we might have services that would be able to help you. Gosh, we even have our newest service, which is called CertiCensus, that can manage your census file for you, keep it up to date, and audit ready at all times. So again, please contact your sales rep or your account manager, and we'd love to speak with you. With that, I think, Megan, I'll turn it over to you. I know we've got 1 minute left for questions, but if there's one or two that you want me to try and cover, I can certainly do that. I will leave that up to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Jason, and good job. You had a lot of good information, and we did get some questions in. We obviously don't have time to get to them all, and we understand if you have to drop out. But we'll do a couple here before we wrap up for the day. The first question here is finding lost participants. Like, how can you find them in the most timely manner?
Sure. It's actually a good question. It's a little bit when we're talking about finding lost participants, and if we're talking about the death audit today. So a little bit off topic on that, but I will try and still hit it. Because maybe it was connected back to that. So it sounds like it might have been a multi-point question and not specifically death audit, but I want to mention the fact that in CertiDeath, and our death audit, you will find deaths faster because that is sometimes part of that, but really in finding missing or lost participants, that would go back to the previous slide. And there's a lot of nuances that are within that. And, what we can do, and Megan, what I would probably recommend is let's capture who was asking that question, because we do have a series of, both ad hoc services as well as the service that I'd mentioned before, which is CertiCensus. And our solutions actually can mirror back to the FAB that was released last year, which is that field assistance bulletin, or the recommendations that the DOL threw out there. And so we've got services anywhere from just checking an electronic address up to fulfilling that FAB by walking through that. So we'll certainly reach out to you, or really if anybody has questions around missing participants, just like I had mentioned before, please reach out to us. We'd love to learn more about what you're trying to accomplish, you know, what type of population it is, and suggest a service that might be appropriate.
Perfect. We'll do one more quick question and then we'll wrap it up. And we have a lot of other questions and we'll get back to you individually with the answers. But the one we'll wrap up with is, do you search for death records in Canada?
That's a good question, actually. So if you're, again, it's interesting, and sometimes you want to answer a question with a question to get more information, right? So it's actually maybe a multi-point one again. But if you're asking about, do we check SINs? And this isn't a harken back to my choir reference either. SIN is the social ID number for the folks that are in Canada. We do not check those. So the answer for that would be no. But if they do have a social security number, then it is possible. You know, for expats, things of that nature, we get asked often if we can check foreign addresses, things of that nature. You know, if they have a social security number, we do have ways of looking for those individuals, or at least kind of their last known address, and trying to contact them. So, you know, again, if it's for a social ID number or somebody who is Canadian born, the answer would be no, although that always changes, so stay tuned. But you know, if they have a social security number, I would say give us a call.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate all the questions. I wish we had time to answer all of them on this call, but we don't want to go over too much on our time. We're already 4 minutes past. We know your time is valuable. So we will reach out to you here within the next week or so and answer these questions. So in the meantime, if you have anything you want answered right away, just feel free to email us, respond to our recording and messages and stuff, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So thanks again, and have a great day, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.